Welcome to my new calculus channel. My name is John Gabriel. In this YouTube video, I'm going to discuss why m plus n is always a factor of the numerator in the new calculus finite difference, and also why the new calculus is a rigorous formulation and the mainstream calculus is just a bogus formulation of calculus that was never rigorized, not by Weierstrass, not by Cauchy, not by anybody else. It's a load of rubbish whose results are generally correct, but the formulation is a myth. Excuse me. So now, let's get on with it. The new calculus derivative is defined as follows. What does all that mean? Okay, well, let's see very quickly what that means. If you look at this diagram here, m is the horizontal distance from the point of tangency to the end point of a parallel secant line, and n is also the horizontal distance on the other side of the point of tangency to the other end of the parallel secant line. See, this line here is a parallel secant. Okay? So, if you look at the new calculus here, the slope of the tangent line, is determined by finding the slope of a parallel secant line. So there are infinitely many mn pairs that will give you the slope of that tangent line. Notice that in the new calculus, the slope is always correct. There is no nonsense like limits, infinity, or infinitesimals. You always get the correct slope. Whereas in the bogus calculus down here, it's never correct. Watch this. See? And even at the point of tangency, something very strange happens. You get a 0 over 0 quotient, which I'm not going to bother right now, but this here becomes undefined in the bogus calculus, which is the mainstream calculus. So, it doesn't matter how you look at this. The new calculus always works correctly, okay? And you can play around with this applet. I'll put a link to it in the details section of the YouTube video. So, these distances here, m and n, have a special relationship with the point of tangency. That relationship is called the auxiliary equation, and I'll explain a little bit more now as we go along in the presentation. So, a question that I'm asked often is, why can't I substitute 0 in the new calculus derivative before the factor m plus n is cancelled and the finite difference ratio simplified? It's very simple, you moron, because in this form here, the ratio represents the slope of a parallel secant line, and no parallel secant line has the mn pair 0, 0. So if you go back to this here, that's what it means, see? This finite difference ratio represents the slope of a parallel secant line. You cannot put 0, 0 in there, you bloody idiot. Do you understand that? Because none of these secant lines here have the mn pair 0. Does that sink into your thick skulls, you orangutans? Of sci.math especially? Fools like Dan Christensen, the big troll, Zelos Malem, an incorrigible idiot called me, and all the other morons that sit on sci.math. That's why you cannot put mn 0 before the quotient is simplified. But after the quotient is simplified, you can, and I'll explain to you in a moment why you can. You can't now in the bogus calculus, you can't do any of these things because it's broken beyond repair. So, let's continue. In comparison, the bogus mainstream calculus ratio, this ratio here, represents nothing but a non-parallel secant line slope before the ratio is simplified and the limit applied. So if you look back here, it's this brown secant line here. It never represents the slope of that tangent line. It's just bullshit, okay? See? 0 over minus 0, or 0 over 0. It's just crap, whichever way you look at it. Now, why can I substitute 0 in the NC derivative after the factor is cancelled and the finite difference ratio simplified? Here's the answer, you moron. Pay attention. Because the new calculus derivative is always expressed as k plus q of xmn, where that is the auxiliary equation. Now, if you want proof of this, go to my new calculus site, this site here, and look at the proof. There is a grade 8 proof here, which shows you why the auxiliary equation must be 0. And so there are two proofs. The first proof is a very simple proof that this definition in the new calculus is the derivative, and the second one that the auxiliary equation must be true. In other words, the terms in m and n are all 0. Okay? Now, so in comparison, the bogus mainstream calculus expression, which is illegally obtained by this bogus expression here, has no meaning because q of h equals to 0 is nonsense. And yet setting q of h equal to 0 is called applying the limit. Don't make me laugh, you idiots. Setting q of h equal to 0, also known as applying the limit, has no rationale. Okay, epsilonics doesn't make it rigorous or anything. Epsilonics merely explains the mechanics of the bogus thinking in the mainstream. It's just monkey business as usual. It violates all logic, both before and after the difference quotient is simplified. So you'll hear the ignorant mainstream morons claim that nothing is being set to 0 and that only a limiting process is being applied. This is nonsense. This is untrue. The bogus limiting process means q of h equals to 0, which means h is equal to 0. When you apply the limit, you set h is equal to 0. Did you get that, you moron? Yes, you do set h is equal to 0. Otherwise, you're not applying the limit. So contrary to the orangutans in the mainstream who claim that h is never set to 0, this is exactly what the limiting process does. In fact, for you to even simplify the finite difference in the bogus mainstream calculus, you have to divide by 0 factor. Okay, the 0 factor is h. Epsilonics changes nothing. Now, try to disprove it, you incorrigible moron. Here you go. All right, use the function x squared. What you get is 2x plus q of h. Now, tell me, you huge mainstream gorilla, how do you get f dash of x is equal to 2x? From this, how do you get it? Hello, you set q of h is equal to 0. In other words, you apply the limit, you idiot. Not to mention that arriving at 2x plus h is done illegally in the bogus calculus. Okay, so now, let's summarize. The new calculus derivative is valid both before and after m plus n is cancelled in the finite difference ratio. Before the factor is cancelled, all of the mn pairs in the parallel secant line space are valid. Hey, they refer to the slopes of the parallel secant lines, which, by the way, are also the slope of the tangent, you fucking morons of sci.math. After the factor is cancelled, even the 0, pair is valid. But in the bogus mainstream calculus, the finite difference is never valid, not before h is cancelled and not after h is cancelled. Only the general derivative is valid when the bogus limiting process is applied. In other words, h is set equal to 0. The bogus calculus finite difference thus never represents the actual derivative at a point. Using the new calculus derivative, the actual derivative is always valid. Now, the bogus calculus requires limit theory, which in turn requires that a valid construction of real numbers exist. But there is no valid construction. I have disproved both the Dedekind cuts and Cauchy equivalence class of sequences, and I've done that in this particular this particular article of mine, to which I'll provide a link as well. Okay, it's a brilliant, ingenious disproof of Dedekind cuts and Cauchy sequences. And I'd advise you to study it, because mathematics is made up of numbers. And if you don't understand numbers, how can you understand mathematics? After Euclid and before I came along, not a single academic moron understood what is a number. I was the first to understand what Euclid was attempting to do. And I explained that in my articles. Okay. For example, here I explain in this article what it means for a concept to be well defined, and also in my article called How We Got Numbers. So, How We Got Numbers on LinkedIn. This article here explains the true story of how we got numbers, and not the bogus garbage that you read in so many books trying to tell you how we got numbers. So read this article, because if you haven't read this article, you don't have a clue what is a number. Don't trust me. Read it, you moron. Read it. Okay, so the only numbers are the rational numbers. There are no other numbers. Because, why? Because a number is by definition the measure of a magnitude. Incommensurable magnitudes, that is, magnitudes which are not commensurate with any other, such as pi, e, and square root 2, are not numbers. They are symbols for incommensurable magnitudes. There are no numbers that describe their measure. Formulas for approximating these magnitudes do not equate to measure, you idiots. Because measure is by definition complete. It's not approximate or partial, as in a Taylor series or a binomial expansion or any other nonsense that you care to think about, because your brains are dysfunctional. I am John Gabriel, the discoverer of the new calculus and the greatest mathematician ever. This is a presentation on the new calculus channel, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you don't take anything I've said to be true, but question everything and go and study it and make sure that you understand it, because what you're being taught, everything that's been written in the garbage textbooks that you've learned out of, is wrong. I am right and everybody else is wrong. Yes, that sounds cranky, but in this case, I'm not the crank, you are. Till next time, goodbye.